as a student, I had, I would say, a very sort of peripheral interest in period instruments, just as much as I was kind of globally interested in music, period. Um, so I guess my first meaningful encounter with it was probably like a lot of other people of my general generation when Roger Norrington's Beethoven cycle came out. I think, I want to say that was 1989, somewhere around there. And not long after that, he came and conducted us in Montreal. At that time, I was a member of the Montreal Symphony. Um, so I was obviously curious what his approach would be because he really opened up a lot of doors for orchestral music in terms of using period instruments and examining period practice. I mean, it's a movement that dates back 100 years or more, but in terms of anything later than the Baroque period, there hadn't been a lot done. Um, so he came and he conducted the Montreal Symphony, and he didn't do anything very doctrinaire in terms of the equipment we used, or intonation, or articulations, or anything like that. But I really liked his approach. And in particular, I remember a lecture he gave at the time that he came at McGill University. And he talked about how his musicians and how he approached specifically Beethoven scores in terms of period practice. And I found it incredibly eye-opening and stimulating because, to sort of put it in a nutshell, he said what they did was just took the scores, took the instruments, tried to play them as well as they could, and then didn't kind of have any preconceptions about, what should a horn sound like when it's fortissimo? What should an oboe sound like when it's pianissimo? You just look at the score, you do what the instrument can do, and then you listen open-mindedly to what comes out. And do it as well as you can, obviously, but just kind of let the instruments speak for themselves in a way. And what he found, and what I think a lot of people now accept, is that what you really hear is this whole universe of sound colors, this whole range of sonority that we have kind of left behind in some ways as the instruments have, quote unquote, progressed, as they've changed over the centuries. Around the late 80s, I started studying the natural horn more seriously, and I've performed on it quite a bit since then. Not with the Boston Symphony, except in a couple of contemporary works, but with other groups, both in Boston and elsewhere. But what I guess it's really led me to is a more complete understanding of what the composers up to, in our case, about 1820, 1825, what they really had in mind for my instrument. So for example, with Mozart and Beethoven, broadly speaking, the difference between a horn of their time and a horn of our time is the modern one has valves. And as a result, it makes playing a full scale like a piano, like a violin, much simpler and much more even, especially. The old instrument can play all those notes, but they sound very different one to the next. Some sound very closed, some sound very open. So for a second-rate composer, that's a problem because they can't simply do on the horn what they could do on a more chromatic instrument. In the hands of a first-rate composer, they turn it into an advantage, and so they use those varieties of sound to reflect the varieties of expression that they want from a piece. And even they use the variety of sound to make the structure of a bigger piece more clear, so that when we get to a part of a piece that has more tension, that's more dynamic, Mozart or Beethoven will put the horn in a different key so that it sounds tighter, it sounds more hard. And then when you get back home, it kind of opens up and sounds clear and open. So that, to me, is something that's worth keeping because it's so intrinsic to their ideas about the music that they wrote. I think it probably comes as a surprise to non-musicians who are used to looking at the orchestra and seeing how we look like such a unified group, but actually as people and as artists, it tends to be very heterogeneous. It tends to be a group that, getting an orchestra to agree on anything is like herding cats. You know, it's just there's nothing that a whole orchestra will agree on. So certainly the question of period practice is sometimes, I mean, it's fair to say it's a little bit inflammatory with modern orchestras because for a variety of reasons, some of them good, some of them not, but I think we tend to be an inherently fairly conservative group. So we tend to have approaches that we're used to, that we like, that work, and sometimes, you know, the comfort zone can get fairly small. Having said that, all orchestras now, more and more, have people in them that really understand and really appreciate and pursue period practice and really want to know about old instruments and old techniques. And that's definitely true of the BSO. There are a lot of people who really embrace that. And I think also we're a very professional group, so we do our best to do what conductors ask for. So in the past, when we've had conductors come, recently a couple of people a year come in who you would say really are specialists, and if they're wise and if we're careful, we tend to find sort of a common ground. So conductors don't come in and, you know, hand the violinists a Baroque bow and say, you must play on this, or insist that we tune down to 415 or anything. But they like to have a little more flexibility with some of the technical things, like, for instance, with vibrato, or like specific kinds of articulation, lengths of notes, shapes of notes, ornaments, trills, turns, those kinds of things. All the kind of basic language of classical and Baroque repertoire. And so I think we do a pretty good job of following along with that and giving a performance that, if it's not exactly what C.P.E. Bach or Haydn heard while he was still alive, it's something that they would enjoy and appreciate, and it would sound like the same piece of music.